Spoiler alert, the title for this video is a bit of clickbait. I did not get in a fight with Brad. However, I did have a disagreement with him on a video that he posted regarding a cable fly and how he is doing it versus how I would go about that motion. Before I get into that, a lot of you guys need to be way more okay with people disagreeing. That's a healthy part of exchanging ideas and moving things forward. It's essentially the basis for how we move science forward is we pick apart things and we try and figure out where we disagree. Dissenting opinions tend to lead to growth and innovation in a field. So disagreement is healthy. I mean, the thing is to just be respectful about it. And, you know, if you disagree with somebody, it's give and take. So keep that in mind. That being said, a ton of comments erupted out of this disagreement, which is cool, but it also let me know that a lot of people weren't quite understanding what the two of us were saying. And so I'm gonna try and show you guys my opinion and kind of what's going on in this exercise. And that way you can have an informed opinion for yourself. And you know what? Whether you choose to do it Brad's way or you choose to do it this way, that's completely up to you. But let's kind of walk through what this exercise was. So I'm gonna mimic Brad's exercise video that he posted here, but I will post a clip of it as well. But essentially he was doing a fly roughly in about this position where he was bringing the hands together, but he was doing it in a very elbow flex position. So the elbows were staying flexed the entire time. Now, my comment on that was I thought that in this instance, with this setup here, is that we were limiting the range of motion and limiting the loading in terms of what we could optimally get out of the pec in this exercise. So we're gonna look at this exercise in two different perspectives. So one thing I want you to consider is when I'm in this position and I'm like this, right? If the cable is in line with my arm, pulling that way, it's not pulling back, right? So I essentially need to be, if I want to challenge this position of the exercise, the weight has to be pulling me back. And then as I come across, if I want more range of motion, if my hands are running together, the only way, if I'm gonna do this 2 arm at a time, to get more range of motion is to allow those to extend. So let's talk about the latter of there first. So if we look at this exercise, right, and I'm bringing this in, and I'll just go ahead and leave this arm in this space, right? So I'm going from here to here, but if I were to take this and bring this around, you can see that I'm able to get a lot more range of motion, a lot more adduction. I'm able to shorten the pec more if I straighten my arm out, right? So from a range of motion perspective, we can't really make the argument that this isn't less than this. So now you could talk about the pros and cons of having the whole arm loaded versus not having the elbow flexion loaded in this position, but you can't argue the range of motion component. So there's where you could have some debate on that. Now I'm gonna try and solve both of those as I incorporate the solution for the back end here, which is in this position, I would want the weight to be pulling more back so that I had something to do the more flexion-based component before I started doing the coming around, part. So this is an arc motion. So ideally, I'd have a resistance that moved in an arc, which would look more, going this way, and then it would start to come around this way. But if I have a cable that's just pointed this way, it's more just pointed that way. So to solve that, to get in something that would be more similar to the arc, what I could do is instead of being here, because in this position, right, essentially it's just pulling me out. So my biceps are taking pretty much, or my elbow flexors, I should say more appropriately, are doing a lot of the work. It's isometric, but it doesn't matter that it's isometric. They're still managing this load. They don't have to be doing concentric or eccentric to actually be holding the load, okay? So to make this less biceps and more chest, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start walking forward a little bit. So now what this has done is now the cables are pulling me back more and out less. So basically, the closer the cable starts to get to in line with my forearm, the less it's gonna be loading the elbow, right? So if I start to come out here and that cable's going from here like this to coming closer to my arm, that means that less of this is loading trying to extend my elbow and more of it is loading trying to extend my shoulder. So I'm going from essentially here, like there's like no load on the pec. It's all the load is here, right? As I start to come in here, less of it is on my bicep and more of it is on the chest and shoulders for this motion. Now, if I go through this motion, obviously if I were to keep the elbow bend, that wouldn't work very well because the cables are literally going to be running into my arm and it's still not very much range of motion. But if I'm here, right, and I do kind of a hybrid press, fly type motion, I can get a good stretch here, right? So I got some elbow bend. I'm able to really stretch and then get more range of motion, okay? So I would say that is both better in terms of loading the chest and the shoulders in this position and then also loading them through a greater range of motion. Whether or not you decide that's better or not would depend on whether or not you think that we want the load to be acting on those muscles and whether or not you want to be going through more range of motion. Now, there was a reference to some sort of mechanical modeling or whatnot in terms of, you know, is this better than this? And I have no idea what that is, so I can't make any comment. What I can say is that when we're looking at the pecs, right, you know, obviously if we're trying to shorten them, we're trying to get some amount of adduction. Like this is shortened pec, this is lengthened pec, and the pec motion and the pec mechanics are actually a little bit better when they're tighter to the body rather than being flared out like this, because in this plane they get to utilize that rib cage, so they gain a mechanical bias over some of the other shoulder muscles. So this tends to be a better motion, and this is what we do these things that I call them like press arounds. I would say that's a superior exercise to a fly in general. So, you know, this motion here, I would say is better than this motion, but not as good as this motion, which this motion, to get this much range of motion, you can't do that bilateral. So you have to take each exercise with its pros and cons and see, you know, if and how it fits your goals and if it's the best option you have available to fit those goals. But in my opinion, I don't think there's any reason to do the exercise like this where you're getting limited loading here and limited range of motion here if we can take a little bit of a step forward and we can get better loading here and more range of motion there, right? That's my opinion on this exercise in terms of making it better. But if I was talking about making the best exercise for pecs, I would probably do less of these flies and more press around type motions, but that's just